So on this Easter morning, I want to share three happy themes: darkness, death, and children of light. So first, darkness. You know, one of the things about darkness, especially early in the morning, it's sometimes hard to tell when night has ended and day has begun. And in that twilight, in that darkness, sometimes it's hard to make things out clearly. It's hard to understand. And that's true not only visually, but it's also true sometimes as a metaphor, psychologically or mentally or spiritually. And so trying to understand things, trying to come to a clear vision is part of why we're here today. And there was an Easter Sunday where a pastor wanted to do something with the children, so he had all the kids come up in front of church, and he was going to ask them some questions to get them to participate. And so he started out and he said, "Okay, boys and girls, what is gray and furry and likes to climb on trees?" No one raised their hand. So he said, "Okay, boys and girls, what's gray and furry and likes to climb on trees and eats nuts?" No one raised their hand. He goes, "Okay, boys and girls, what's gray and furry, likes to climb on trees and eat nuts, and it has a big bushy tail?" So Johnny raised his hand, and the pastor called and he said, "Yes, Johnny, what's the answer?" And he said, "Well, Pastor, I know the answer is supposed to be Jesus, but that sure sounds like a squirrel to me." Sometimes what we believe sounds like nonsense to the rest of the world. And sometimes what we proclaim might even sound a little like nonsense to us. You know, we've gathered together today because we believe that Jesus was a real historical person. And there's factual evidence of that. We've gathered together today because we believe that he died and rose from the dead. And there are eyewitness testimonies to that. And we've gathered together today because we want to proclaim to the world what a difference that makes to us and to the whole world. Now, to the rest of the world, that does sound a lot like nonsense. And the challenge for us is, do we really believe that? Do we really not only profess faith in the risen Lord, but do we allow it to change our lives? Because if what we profess to believe is true, then this is the most important thing in the world. And if what we profess is not true, then this is the most ridiculous thing in the world. The only thing it is not is moderately important. You know, this either is the most important part of our life or the least important part of our life, but it can't be moderately important, because we are challenged today to decide what we really believe. Do we believe what we profess? And if we do, how does that change us? And of course, we live in a world where the truths of Christianity do seem like a lot of nonsense. In fact, we live in a very scientific world. And we have Oak Ridge just right down the road from us. And one of the things that is a challenge to our day and age is that many people have examined the story of Christianity, and they found it uncompelling. They've found it incredible. Because, you know, it's one thing to have these myths when you are ancient people and when you live in darkness, but we live in the scientific age. And because we are scientific people, we know that science has tested methodologies that work all the time. And because of science, we know that we don't have to believe in magic and miracles, because science can pretty much explain the whole world. The only problem is that science has an underlying premise. All scientists know that if the world is not intelligible, there is no science. If there isn't a reason to the world that we live in, science would be impossible. There has to be an order. Gravity works. You know, and the wonderful thing about gravity is whether you believe in it or not, it still works. The wonderful thing about the laws of nature is that they always work. And the world is not just some random chaos. It actually functions in an orderly way, and it has a mind. It has a reason to it. And that alone should give us pause, because we live in the most amazing place in the world in East Tennessee. And when we look around us, we should be captivated by the beauty that surrounds us. But not only captivated, we should ask deeper questions. What or who created all of this? Now let's assume for a minute that we can have a rational argument with those who don't believe the Christian story, and that we can even convince them that God is real, that God exists, that Jesus is a real person. Even if we do that, we have another problem, and that's the problem in the gospel today. We have the problem of death and suffering. And it's a real problem because if people believe in God, what they see is a world filled with suffering, a world filled with death. And if you've personally experienced the death of a loved one, it is a shock to the system. It is a challenge to our belief. Because even if I believe that God is real, well, why is God so mean? Why is God so cruel? Why would God leave me alone? Why would God not protect me and my family? And that's an important question. And that's also why when the women go to the tomb, they're going to a place of death. They go to a tomb because they have seen their beloved friend Jesus die. And they know what death looks like, and they know what death feels like. What they don't know yet is resurrection. And so when they go to the tomb, they encounter an empty tomb. And they're even told, "Why are you looking for the living one among the dead?" And we do that too. We look for a sign of God's goodness, but most often what we see is suffering and death. And so today challenges us to see resurrection, to see that God's response to the suffering and the death that surrounds us is to enter into it himself and to show us that death doesn't control us. You know, one of the wonderful gifts of believing in the resurrection is it gives us a tremendous freedom. What is the scariest thing that we all face? Our own death. What is the best tool of bullies and tyrants around the world to threaten us with death, right? Every tyrant throughout the history of humanity has always used death as a way to instill fear in the population. That's why the crucifixion was such a horrific tool of the Roman Empire, because it kept people in line. Out of fear of suffering and death, people obeyed the rules. But you see, as Christians, we don't believe that death is really the final story. We don't believe that death controls us, and because of that, because we profess resurrection, we are the freest of all people. And in fact, today, after the homily, we're going to renew our baptismal promises where we reject sin and death, because death is a result of sin. It wasn't really part of God's plan for us. God's plan for us was life and happiness. And so when we reject sin and death, we reject everything that is contrary to God's plan. And then we'll profess our faith. And then I get to go around and I get to sprinkle holy water on all of you, and I can't wait to hear if there's any sizzles. One of the things about our baptism is that because we were baptized into Christ, into his death and into his resurrection. And in the baptism liturgy, one of the things we do is we take a candle and we light it from this enormous Easter candle. And we pass that light of Christ to the newly baptized person, and we say, "Receive the light of Christ. You are to walk always as a child of the light, preserving the faith, so that when the Lord comes, you might go out with all the saints in the heavenly kingdom to greet him." That's our destiny. That's our call. That's our hope. That's why we're here today, because we believe that death is not our destiny. Death does not control us. Death does not dominate our days. In fact, the opposite is true. Because we are children of the light, we do not have to walk in the darkness of sin and death. Because we are children of light, we have the freedom of God's children to recognize that sin and death have no place in our lives. They have no role to play for us. And we come here today to strengthen one another, to realize that the world desperately needs the light of Christ. And the only way to bring that light of Christ into the world is for us to take our baptism candle, to profess our faith loudly and clearly so that the world sees what resurrection belief does. It allows us to live in a different way, to live in a way that sees opportunities to lighten the burdens of others, that sees opportunities to eliminate the darkness of sin and death. It sees opportunities for us to bring Christ into this world where it is desperately needed. And so today, as we celebrate the resurrection, we celebrate the power of God's love for us. We celebrate the reality of God's love that frees us from all things that should scare us, even from death itself.